Larry here with 7 Sage Law School Prep. This is a video analysis of one of the two winning answers to our drunk texting Hypo contest. This one is Umara's answer, Unbelievable Umara. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And this answer assumes that you've done the work on this Hypo, that you've checked the self-scoring sheet, that you've already listened to my general video analysis of the problem, and that you've reviewed Umara's answer unedited. To be clear, I'm going to be analyzing her answer at a bunch of different levels. The first is general word economy, things that we need or maybe we don't need. The second is word choice, especially those words that will provide more clarity to the answer and certain keywords that might kind of annoy a professor or lead you to think you're saying something that you're not. And then more generally, I'm going to point out the bits of analysis that I thought were very good and other places where I thought could have used some work. Last bit of caveats. This was not a perfect answer. On the other hand, it's an early one, and it was one of the best ones I received. Things are only going to get better. So as you watch the relatively heavy ink I'm going to apply to these answers, when I used to tutor students, even A students' answers, I would just slaughter on paper. This was a pretty good analysis, and I want you, specifically Umara, to feel good about that. This answer was a full IRAC answer. Even so, I think that this first paragraph is not really necessary. You can take a lot of shortcuts. This isn't a legal brief. Things you can do here is just write a quick headline without even any verbs in it if you want to state what the issue is. Now, here it's not even necessary to do that because the whole thing is just the one issue of IIED as to the Doctor Who fan versus the drunk person. Short headline that goes like this should do the trick. This is shorthand, but the professor looks at it and in an instant knows what you're talking about. And that's your issue. Here you've got the rule that with a mini IRAC analysis, which is what you'll really use in practice on a lot of exams, you wouldn't do this. This is fine, and I gave a point for that, as you can tell from the self-scoring sheet. One important word choice note. I don't like the use of the word defendant or plaintiff because that's relative. You want to use absolute references where possible. Here the defendant is the Doctor Who fan, and here the plaintiff is the formerly drunk person. Why? In one issue, this won't get confusing, but in an entire fact pattern, you will have parties. No one will be the plaintiff and the defendant all the way through. There will be cross-claims going in both directions, and if you have to keep switching who the defendant is, who the plaintiff is, that can get very confusing very quickly. So always stick with the absolute reference. Doctor Who fan, formerly drunk person. Second, a word choice thing I think that is important is, I wouldn't say could argue. I would always say would argue. The reason for that is there's a slight distinction. Could argue sounds non-committal. It sounds like you're too hesitant about making a mistake. Just commit to it. You only have the argument that you have, or you have multiple other arguments. So avoid could where you can. Another bit of word choice here is there's no need to refer to a party's attorney. So I would have reduced this all to FTP would argue that, and I'd get rid of that, DW acted intentionally or recklessly. Now I thought this analysis was quite good. It digested the facts of the story. You're not told directly this. This is a good synthesis of what's going on in the text, that DW just kept on going with the story. She kept texting different bits and pieces of things to the drunk person, and clearly the plaintiff was confused. Instead of stopping, DW continued to provide reasoning to make the story more plausible. I thought that was good analysis. There are several counter-arguments. I think this is stretching it too much. I think you've seen in my earlier videos that there's a line between making reasonable inferences and stretching too much, and I think this is too much. You're told at the top of the fact pattern that a friend of mine randomly got a drunk text. She earned my respect and awe. There's nothing in here that even comes close to suggesting that the friend who did this, the Doctor Who fan, was mentally unstable or genuinely believed she was a time traveler. So I would not have said this, and as you can tell from my self-scoring sheet, I think the intent element here is pretty clear. It's not one that Dr. Hufan is going to win on. She clearly meant to send these texts. It wasn't an accident. You don't always have to put up a defense. One of the important things as you go through fact pattern is to distinguish between close cases and easy wins on one side. If you notice that one side is going to easily win the point, say that. This question is not even close. I think that's what you believed here, Umara, so I wouldn't have put that argument up here. Continuing on the intent element, I did not understand what this had to do with intent. Intent has to do with Doctor Who's mental state and not the formerly drunk person's. So I agree that the better view is that, and I wouldn't say element one, I said, just say that the defendant was acting intentionally. Frankly, I'm confused as to what drunk person's mental state has to do with whether or not DW intended to do what she did. So let's turn to the next element. If you want to have headings, you can have them. I think that this sentence isn't really necessary. You can just go right into it. I'm not sure this was sort of a dictionary definition of extreme and outrageous. I guess it's good to set out that ground. I think one thing that would have helped here is to compare what the Doctor Who fan did with something that's really extreme or shocking. But again, I like what's done here. You're not just repeating the facts, but you're synthesizing them. They're lengthy, careful details, really careful consideration going into making up all these facts in tricking the texter. I think you're absolutely right that the Doctor Who fan would just say that they were just trying to be funny and that they were just being very detailed and not going, just kidding, just kidding. This is another great fact. The defendant could argue that plaintiff had the opportunity to stop, but did not. And I think this is the right conclusion. I think that the reasoning could have been fleshed out a little bit more. I loved this. It makes me feel like you've been watching the other materials, that even if the analysis would be done here, that this is not extreme and outrageous, for the sake of continuing the argument, let's assume this element is met. Good. So now we've reached causation. That lead isn't necessary, but you could just drop in a one-word title, boom. This was sort of interesting to me, that maybe plaintiff was already in a state of emotional distress. Certainly the first text complains that they're only straight men, everyone totally drunk right now. The problem with this paragraph is it didn't make the prima facie case. You always start with what the plaintiff's argument here, and that hasn't been established. You jump right to what DW would have said in response, but I didn't see the case here for how FDP would argue that DW caused the emotional stress that she claimed that she suffered. This was definitely an interesting point here, that FDP was already in a state of emotional distress. You can see from that. I think of all of the analysis of the elements, this one point could have used more work. So first, make FDP's argument against DW, then you can begin to talk about counter-argument. And I think this was not super clear. I totally understand that given the very bare-bones elements that I presented. But this element, it's the link between DW's actions and FDW's harms. It doesn't have to do with the content, whether or not it was excessive or outrageous, and it doesn't have so much to do with what FDP ultimately suffered. It's the linkage. If the conduct was extreme and outrageous, and if FDP really did suffer harm, did DW cause it? And I don't feel that this was really an analysis of that. But again, I think that might have been because I wasn't super clear about what that element was supposed to be. I think for the reasons set out in the score sheet, I think this is a close question or in favor of the Doctor Who fan. It's really not clear that he caused any harm. The linkage here, even though he did send all these obnoxious texts, is whether or not FDP believed all of this stuff. But look at the score sheet for that. Now, on this part, the severe emotional distress element, I thought this was a pretty good analysis. I think this is right. We don't have other evidence of plaintiff's mental state, but you just kind of have to deal with that. You're just given the facts as they are, so what else can you do? This is the evidence that we have of any mental distress on the drunk person's part. I'm also a little unclear as to this counter-argument. It's sort of clever, but it's kind of a blame the victim thing by saying, if the plaintiff was intoxicated, she couldn't have suffered significant distress. What I like about this, though, is the automatic impulse to do the he said, she said thing. That is, to set up the argument and immediately look for a counter argument. I ultimately think that the Doctor Who fans' best counter arguments are sort of elsewhere. They're in doing a really close reading. I'm seriously going to have a panic attack. I'm going to have a panic attack. Look at the scoring sheet to see my views on this, but basically it's not clear to me that, even from the evidence as given, even given that this drunk person is saying she's going to have a panic attack, that she's suffering severe emotional distress. But look at the scoring sheet for that. More important, though, is what's done here, the way that this is presented, pointing out that we don't know exactly what happened, but this is the evidence that we do have that former drunk person would present to make her case, and then some counter-argument quickly. I think you got a lot right here, Amara, in that there's an element of we can't really tell if the supposed victim here isn't just playing along. We're sort of primed to believe that she's completely gullible and is just swallowing all of this whole by the introduction to the text exchange. But I'm not so sure that that's the case. If the plaintiff is just playing along, then I think she's clearly not suffering from severe emotional distress. This is interesting analysis, and it's stuff that wasn't in a lot of the other submissions, but I think it plays out wrong. I think that this fact ultimately goes against the plaintiff. If she's playing along, she's probably not suffering severe emotional distress. It puts into question her saying stuff like this. Is she playing a role here? Oh no, I'm scared, or is she really scared? So I don't agree with that conclusion, but that's less important to me than the fact that what I look at holistically, and that's true despite the ink I've laid down on the rest of this, that there's a good back and forth. There's a good he said, she said. There's thought about what's the argument, what's the counter to that counter. That's a great instinct to have as you go through fact patterns. And then I can see here that Amara went for trying to like tip the balance by being funny. I did appreciate it. Check this out yourself. I won't ruin it for you. I ultimately agree with the conclusion that at least one of the elements isn't met. Again, going back, the conclusion, you'll get a point for that, but it's much less important than the entire back and forth, all of this. So this is a great early effort, Amara. Keep it up. And for those others of you who are watching this, I hope that was helpful.